I am very excited to introduce our next speaker, Robert Samuels, um, who is going to discuss practices that put inclusive writing and reporting at the core of his storytelling. Robert is a national political reporter for the Washington Post who focuses on the intersection of politics, um, policy, and people. He travels the country to chronicle how vivacious political discussion in the nation's capital is impacting the lives of everyday Americans. He previously told stories about life in the district for the Post social issue team. Robert joined the Post in 2011. Before that, he spent 5 years working at the Miami Herald. Robert, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I changed my shirt. Everyone should know I was in a Democracy Dies in Darkness t-shirt a little bit earlier, but I thought it was way too on brand. Um, Thanks for having me. I'm super excited and intimidated to be on the same conference as Steve. I have taken many of Steve's tips to heart over the course of the years. Journalism conferences where I've heard him speak and sing. And this is a little intimidating for me, but I'm really excited to have this discussion about how we frame stories and the lenses in which we look at them. Now, when we talk a lot about inclusive storytelling, I know there are sometimes we think this might not be my thing, depending on my identity. But I hope this session will challenge you and sort of broaden everyone's minds in terms of thinking about how we think about stories and how we tell stories and how we go about reporting. So I've titled this "The People on Your Shoulder," which are going to be our guide to inclusive storytelling. And I'm telling you this as a way of how I do my own reporting. Now, a little bit about me. Beth gave a really wonderful introduction, but I'm a national political enterprise reporter for the Post. For those of you who don't speak newspaper, that means I have a lot of latitude in terms of where I go and what I do. But what I typically do is I think about themes in the country and I travel, and then I look for ways to tell stories that are variations of that theme. If you could go to the next slide. I've been doing that for 10 years. I've been a reporter at the Post for 10 years. I worked at the Miami Herald for 5. And over the time I've done this, I've been a reporter. I've reported from 40 different states and 3 countries, telling the stories of people from those states in different ways and in different forms. When I think about my work, I was trying to find a way of encapsulating what to do and how to find things that are interesting. And I was watching the brilliant Toni Morrison documentary, The Pieces That I Am. And in it, she says something that I think is really important. She goes, in speaking of her own writing, the first thing that I had to do was to eliminate the white gaze. Jimmy Baldwin, he used to talk about the little white man that sits on your shoulder and checks out everything you do and say. So I wanted to knock him off, and you're free. Now I own the world, and that means I can write about anything to anyone and for anyone. Now, that's a really powerful quote because it does feel that when we think about audiences, people who write for a living, we tend to think about, we hear a voice, we hear a little voice that says how an article should sound like, right? And oftentimes it does sound like a white man. And that's no matter who you are, if you're writing for general interest. So the question, a general interest audience. So the question for us really becomes, how do we carry more on our shoulders than this little white man? If we go to the next slide here. Because Toni Morrison, she had it right. She was talking about lens and voice. But she can do that from the perspective in fiction as a Black woman, hoping that everyone will take to the tale. It's a little bit harder in the world of journalism, right? So we have a few challenges. The first one is, how do we conceive writing about stories for all people? That means, how do we do things in a way that you just don't hear one voice speaking to you and one voice that's valued? The second way of thinking about this is, how do we pitch stories that aren't centered around the dominant perspective? You know, how do we zig when others zag, as Gina Roberts used to say? How do we do that? And the third thing is, when we talk about stories and when we produce them about different types of people, you know, I as a person who grew up in the Bronx, I'd see it all the time. I'd see depictions of New York. This is one of the issues with I think the show Friends, right? It talks about, well, that doesn't look like my New York, and thus the show doesn't work for me. So the question becomes now, how do you produce stories that neither condescend to people nor seem glib to a broad cross section of readers? Uh, and so in this presentation, I'm gonna go through two big stories and a third story that goes through a process that I typically go through. And because I'm awkward, I usually think all the world is a figure skating competition, because I love figure skating. And when I think about doing a story, I think about how Oksana Bayul, the great Ukrainian figure skater, I'm sure everyone thought this presentation was headed this way, starts her program. So we have a clip of Oksana Bayul at the 1994 Winter Olympics, if we could play it.
And here she is, tiny waif of a thing. She's got those fawn eyes, Oksana Bayul of Ukraine. You will always see a pause here. Even after her name is called, she says she has to wait for her skates to tell her it's time to go.
All right, if we could stop it there. If we had more time for questions, we could go through the entire performance. But in case you didn't hear what's going on, the announcer has called Oksana Bayul to perform at the Olympics. And the first thing Oksana Bayul does is she does not move. She stands and she centers herself and she starts going through a little meditative practice. She goes when the commentator says, when the skates tell her to go. If we go to the next slide, when I think about inclusive storytelling, the first conversation is always with myself. And that conversation is about my natural instincts about how to tell a story. And I think about what my natural curiosities are when there's a strain of news that I have to riff off. I think about where I'm getting my ideas. Are they coming from bantering in a room of people that look a lot like me? Are they coming from my wife? Are they coming from someone else? And in a lot of cases, I think a lot of reporters have sources, go-to people. And so the question that I often ask myself is, who are my sources when I'm conceiving this idea, right? Do they all have the same perspective politically? Are they all from the same place? Do they have the same race? Do they all work? Are they all professors? Are they all cops? And if there isn't a diversity of people in terms of having the conversations on how I conceive stories, then I need to rethink things. I'll give you an anecdote. So I'm going to tell you my two best sources. I don't have pictures of them because neither of them like to be photographed. But the first best source I have is my own mother. You know, she's an immigrant from Jamaica. She likes to read. She is not well versed in every policy, but she's open-minded and she has thoughts. And so When something big in the news is happening, I talk to her. Another person I talk to quite regularly, is a guy from the suburbs of Dubuque, Iowa. I'm sure many of us have been there, named Monty Alexander, who I profiled way in 2016. Now, Monty, he dropped out of high school. He voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. He sees the world in a very different way. And so when I think about types of stories I do, I try to incorporate them. I carry them on my shoulder. What do they want to know? Is this the same conversation I'm having with myself? And so I'm going to give some different examples of different types of stories that I've done. We're going to go through two in depth and one not so in depth, so we could see how it works. And we have another video, and that video comes from a debate featuring, now I know we all love Mayor and now Secretary Pete. This isn't to malign him in any way, but it features him during one of the debates when he was going to run for president.
I'm pulling it up right now, forgive me.
Your community of South Bend, Indiana has recently been in uproar over an officer-involved shooting. The police force in South Bend is now 6% Black in a city that is 26% Black. Why has that not improved over your 2 terms as mayor?
Because I couldn't get it done. My community is in anguish right now because of an officer-involved shooting. A Black man, Eric Logan, killed by a white officer. I'm not allowed to take sides until the investigation comes back. The officer said he was attacked with a knife, but he didn't have his body camera on. It's a mess, and we're hurting. And I could walk you through all of the things that we have done as a community, all of the steps that we took from bias training to de-escalation, but it didn't save the life of Eric Logan. And when I look into his mother's eyes, I have to face the fact that nothing that I say will bring him back. This is an issue that is facing our community and so many communities around the country. And until we move policing out from the shadow of systemic racism, whatever this particular incident teaches us, we will be left with the bigger problem of the fact that there's a wall of mistrust put up one racist act at a time, not just from what's happened in the past, but from what's happening around the country in the present. It threatens the well-being of every community. And I am determined to bring about a day when a white person driving a vehicle and a Black person driving a vehicle, when they see a police officer approaching, feels the exact same thing. A feeling not of fear, but of safety. I'm determined to bring that day about.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right. I'm not sure if you all remember this moment, but during the campaign, this was seen as a very great moment for Pete Buttigieg, or a very telling moment, one of the prime moments of the debate. So I go into the meeting, the politics meeting that we have at the Post afterwards, and I have my thoughts about what happened. And the comments that other people had, they were a lot more like some of the ones I saw on Reddit, which are indicated in the next slide here. So I'm not sure if you could read them, but they say, a grown man answer. Buttigieg is the most eloquent, mature, humble candidate I've ever seen on either party in my entire life. I forgot what honesty and humility looks like. It was so refreshing. And I remember hearing this and thinking to myself, wait, there's another way of looking at this, right? Because he said, I couldn't get it done. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for a politician to say, I couldn't get something done when it came to racial justice and for it to be praised. So I started to ask myself, so the first conversation with myself here was, why am I responding this way? My curiosity is, why did Pete Buttigieg think it was a good answer to tell his community, which has a significant number of Black residents, that he couldn't get something done in the racial justice perspective? And so I wanted to know what he knew about his community. I wanted to know what he knew about Black people. I wanted to know why he thought that answer might not set people off. So I started thinking about other ways of looking at this, and we can continue going with the slides. And the next conversation was with my editor, where I sent an email and said, hey, this story doesn't really feel right to me, because it seems like he's he's admitting something that's a little bit strange. And I don't think I got a response the first time. And then I went back and I thought about it again. And I went through a practice that I learned at the Poynter Institute. If we go to the next slide here. Now, Roy Peter Clark says you should always draft a mission statement for the story, right? And it's usually a one sentence that begins, this is a story about, and it speaks to some universal theme. You know, Gene Weingarten will say every story should be about the meaning of life. That's great. Personally, I found it to be helpful to be more specific. You know, what is this story supposed to tell me? And an editor at the Post, and MacArthur genius, he does it a little bit differently. His mission statements look like this. This story is about blank, and it should be published now because blank. The second way I feel in sort of the legacy newspaper world is a bit more helpful to use. So I sent another email again, and I said, you know, I really think we should do this story. And if we go to the next slide, this is what I actually said. This is a story about how a presidential candidate comes to understand life. And it should be done now because it will help us understand the way a Democratic candidate makes decisions. Now, none of this has to do with the specific messy, icky stuff of race that might be able to turn off some editors. In my case, I don't really think that's the case. But some people are predisposed to that. They need to know that, no, this isn't just a simple story that with a very targeted audience, but it has broad implications for how to actually understand the meaning of life. You can also see this sentence isn't particularly poetic. It just parlays some information. And after they saw that in October, we went on a journey. And the third conversation that I had was with my sources. And I called and I said, hey, you know, Mayor Buttigieg, he's having issues connecting with Black people, and he's polling in some places worse than Donald Trump when it comes to African Americans. And so I think this is an opportunity here for people to understand where his heart is, where his ideas about Black America come from. You know, it's not just about whether or not Pete Buttigieg has name recognition in the Black community. Surely he's been on every magazine cover. He's been on Jimmy Fallon and everything. He's had incredible media saturation. There might be something else. And so I started trying to get the answers to some questions, which are, I asked then Mayor Buttigieg, what are your favorite books by Black authors? Who helped teach you about the Black experience? What conversations did you have about race growing up? How did you learn about differences and negotiating between those differences? And could you connect me with people who could tell that tale? And now I wasn't only talking to people he recommended or people he talked about, but other people in his community about interactions they've had with him. And the result was this story. We go to the next slide, which looks at Pete Buttigieg's way of understanding race. And even though he had lots of media saturation, the storytelling that was brought revealed an anecdote that no one had ever heard before. It started with a television journalist named Renee Ferguson, who had Pete Buttigieg as as an intern when he was a sophomore at Harvard. It was the summer of 2002, and she had been working on an investigation about a sex offender working at a daycare center in the building's basement. The three people, that is the Ferguson, Buttigieg, and the cameraman, they wanted to capture undercover footage of the man on the job. So Renee Ferguson tries to get in the building. She's Black. And the security guard turns her away. The videographer, who's also Black, tries next. And the videographer gets sent away too. Pete Buttigieg, the intern, goes next. And when he approaches the door, the security guard lets him in. Now, Pete Buttigieg secures the footage that helps Renee Ferguson win one of her 7 Emmys. But what stayed with her in that moment was that she faced the prejudice when her young white intern did not. And so she talks about it with him and says, think about all the doors that are open for you that are not open for me. And now he's living with her as during his intern experience in Chicago, and they start to have these conversations about race. The story is very interesting. Now, the reason why, even though this is about Pete Buttigieg, the idea of this is that Black people are not the objects in this story. They are shaping the narrative. They're being elevated as the experts on a white man running for president. Now, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking about this ethically, right? It's bedrocked in the same journalistic principles about going out, speaking truth, reporting it as fully as possible. But it does question who we elevate in stories. And it does question the audience. Are we looking at this in a way that would make sense to the people who are actually affected by the story? And as we go through the narratives and the anecdotes of people who interacted with Pete Buttigieg, we learn that they think he's a little bit clumsy when it comes to this stuff. There's an anecdote that Al Sharpton tells us that when they went to go eat together and they were having fried chicken, Pete Buttigieg, he's so self-conscious, he even asks Al Sharpton if he could eat the fried chicken with his hands. So that's one example of this. The second example is a little bit more personal, and it starts with my very own private Facebook profile a little bit after George Floyd had died in May of last year. And when that started happening, my Venmo, it started sort of ka-chinging, and I kept on getting money from people who I hardly knew, who wanted to give me money for self-care. And it became very strange to me. And so I posted on my private Facebook page, that's why you see the block here. It goes, okay, seriously, this is getting ridiculous. Stop sending me money to get self-care for racism, or because you're having a response to racial tension. I don't want it and I don't need it. It's distracting me from doing my job and generally living my life. You can see my friend Paradise, who's also a journalist, she responds, what? Wait, that's a thing? Yeah, it was a thing. It's not something I wanted to write about, but again, the first conversation in the next slide, the first conversation was with myself. What's my curiosity here? Why did this bother me? And I came to the conclusion that I didn't know why my white friends were acting this way. Something was going on, and there was a process that was happening toward a racial reconciliation. Now, I didn't want to write a trend story about friends giving other friends money. That seemed very personal, and it seemed like I was making fun of people with really good intention. And so I had this idea that perhaps there's a story that we could do a journey story looking at how a person tries to understand race in this climate. And so if we go to the next slide, this is the conversation I had with my editor, the second step of the process. Now, again, this part is a little bit paraphrased in my aspect, but what the editor said is exactly what he said. I said, I want to find a white person who's trying to figure it out, but kind of messing up. This is a story, here's the draft of the mission statement sentence. This is a story about the challenges to achieving equality, and we should tell it now because white people's interests in this will shape how long the momentum will last. My editor, who's a white man, says, it's like stumbling toward wokeness, which I thought was an incredibly poetic phrase. Incredibly poetic phrase. What I did next was I tried to find ways to tell this story. So I had heard of organizations that were having these book clubs and these meetings with white people about allyship. And I asked them if I could sit in on the meeting. Now these meetings were typically all white, led by a multicultural leader, but that space was meant for white people so they could speak openly. So I sat in Zoom conversations with my cameras off, and I started asking people in the meetings, if they could talk to me a little bit about what they were going through and what they were thinking about. That wasn't really working. It felt a little bit awkward. So I emailed some of the major organizations and I asked for places that did good work. They sent me people in New Jersey and in Virginia and in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's when I was drawn to a woman named Christine Tell, and she became my source. And like Monty and my mom, I liked her because she was thoughtful and self-conscious. She was provocative, but she listened. And because she was nuanced as a person, you could get a nuanced story. Sometimes when we choose sources, I think we're wrongly drawn to people who are the most, who say the most outlandish things. But oftentimes I find that readers see themselves in people who are quieter, who are a little bit uncomfortable with the attention, and who are conflicted, because they can channel some of the questions a reader might have. And so I started asking her what she was doing, and she was telling me about reading White Fragility and listening to these podcasts and watching The 13th. And I asked her if she was having debates with anyone, if she was talking to other people about it. And she said, yeah, well, it's not going so well. And I asked her if I could have some conversations with those people too, because I wanted to see how these back and forths go. And if you saw the next slide here, these are actual real life text messages that I sent to Christine when her friends were hesitant about talking to me. I'm not sure if you could read it, so I'll just run through them. It says, if it makes any difference to Matt or your other friends, I'd love to talk to them, even if they don't want to be quoted. I actually really want to hear what they have to say, and their views will help me write a story that's so much clearer. I write about conservatives a lot and can share phone numbers of folks who have trusted me to tell their stories if they want some assurance that I'll do a good job. And then I sent her links to 3 of the pieces that I did. And one said, okay, right away. That's Katie there, her phone number is blocked. And I said, not to bombard you, but I just really want to make sure that they have all the things that they can make the best decision for them. I'm trying to join them in this process. And Christine goes, she talks to one of her friends named Matt, and he changes his mind. He says, yeah, he'll talk to you about it. And then later on, I call and I talk to her, and she says Matt was happy with the experience, which is really great to hear. Now, if we go to the story, the next slide is actually 3 people in the story. And the story was actually called Stumbling Toward Wokeness, because I thought that was a great title. Some of the older people didn't like the title so much. And I sat down and I listened to a lot of the things they were talking about. And so uh, Christine, who's at the top, is telling to preface, the three women, they work at a preschool together. And one of the things that happened over the course of the story is they posted pictures of kids at the preschool, and all of the kids appeared to be white. Some of them were Hispanic, but they were white presenting. And a stranger on Facebook saw the photos and said, "Is this a whites only school?" All of the women were shocked that this was happening. And so they were talking about what they should do to be able to get a more diverse school. They talked about whether they should give scholarships. Maybe they should have more Black baby dolls because there were none. And then Katie, who's on the left corner there, she goes, I'm reading from it, that she agreed that she needed to teach her children to be kind and stand up when people seemed cruel to others, especially minorities. But now it seemed that friends like Tell, that's the woman on top, were asking her to do uncomfortable things that might be taken the wrong way. They were using terms that just seemed to have become popular: white privilege, implicit bias, structural racism. Growing up, racism was never explained to us that way, Columbine said. It was never the system, it was more of a prejudice. That probably also why it's so hard as a white person to know how to help or speak up or be an advocate for the Black community. Christine tells her, but it's our job to speak out. It's our job to hear what's being said to us and take the time to read a book or watch a movie that's recommended, and to try to put our experience aside and really try to understand. I've done that. I watched Just Mercy and the movie about Harriet Tubman. I watched it with my children. That's Columbine. But how does that make life better for anyone in the Black community? How does my not watching a movie keep them down? It says, Tell had not worked out the answer to the question, but sometimes she asked herself, how could she be so sure? She couldn't be so certain because she wasn't certain of anything. In a month, she had realized pervasive racism everywhere, in her family and her friends and in herself. The tectonics of what made it great to be an American seemed to be shifting, and she had no idea what it meant for the future. Now, this story was incredibly popular with our readers. And I think for a lot of white people, it was because they saw themselves in the story, even though the reporter of the story was not white. But I also had other people on my shoulder. I didn't want to write a story that for other people seemed apologetic or unfeeling or deepened the pain that they were going through at that moment. And so I had another conversation with my sources. And I said to Christine, I was like, well, have you spoken to any Black people about this? And Christine said she didn't really have any Black friends, that I was the first Black person she had talked to about this. And I said, well, do you think about meeting one and asking them some questions? And she said, I did. And the reason I was asking this was not for my own knowledge, but because I wanted to see if I could find more voices in the story so it could be more rounded. And she said the only Black people she had really spoken to were on Twitter. So I asked for the tweet. And the tweet said, if we have the next slide, don't make us swim through your tears while we fight. Which for me, we put it in the story in the online version, we put it fairly prominently because it helped channel the fact that she was aware that this was a one-sided type of story. And it gave us the breadth and the avenue to have a discussion with Christine that the reader would want to have, even though they couldn't. So these are two different ways of thinking about things. When they come from a lens that's from your interest, simply from a reporter interest, from the reporter's way of thinking about it, and from one that comes from a question that you have about a group that's not your own and how to make those things inclusive. If we could go to the last slide, I'm just gonna run through the last anecdote here about a story that was a part of our big series that we did last year about George Floyd and how systemic racism shaped his life. So when this was an idea that didn't come from me, it came from my super smart editor. And he asked me if I could do a story looking at health disparities because George Floyd had coronavirus, and in the autopsy, it said he had a number of things that Black people have. He had a trait of sickle cell anemia, that he was unaware about. He had an enlarged heart. He had high blood pressure. He had a drug addiction. And so when I thought about doing this story, we could have thought about any of those threads. And I thought the first conversation, again, was with myself. And I said, well, we've known about coronavirus. We've known about heart disease. All those things have been written about. Is that going to take us to a place that I hadn't seen in a legacy newspaper before? But the other thing that happened to George Floyd's health was he died. He was killed. And one thing that I knew from my personal experience as a Black person in America is that you always have this fear that something's going to happen. And you too will die, either by your own malfeasance or by someone else's. And so the next conversation I had was with my editor. And I said, I don't want to do a story that just kind of looks at a symptom of the problem. Coronavirus, heart disease, all those things are a symptom of a larger problem. But the biggest health struggle for a Black person is to stay alive. How do you stay alive? And so from there, he said, okay, let's do it. And I started with some super smart people who write super smart papers. I drilled down to a recovery center where George Floyd had gone to when he went to Minneapolis to get sober. I drilled down even more to people who were in the recovery center with him. And then I drilled down to his friends and family and his girlfriend, who could talk about the constant state of fighting, the constant war against depression that really wore down his health, to the point that when he saw the officer tap on that car window, he had a look in his face. And so the way I describe it in the story, and this is where I'll end, and I'm happy to take some questions, is that his friends also knew strangers would see Floyd as an aggressive Black man who had to be subdued, a man reduced to his race and record. They worried that the jurors and the public would not see the man who built up his body not to cause trouble, but to stay out of it. The man they worried about because the pandemic and his poverty created a perfect environment for a drug user to relapse. The man who was strong enough to retaliate against the cops, but said, yes, officer, and please, because that's what his mother taught him to do. I know how my baby acts around cops, said Courtney Ross, that's George Floyd's girlfriend. He wouldn't disrespect them. He'd be too scared. It was the fear in Floyd's eyes that his roommate, his best friend, his cohort found so traumatizing. Because at that point, they didn't just see Floyd pleading for his life. They saw their friends realize there was no escape, that the early warnings given to Black boys would become his destiny. They knew that fear, and it was the fear of practically every Black man they knew. And in that case, it's not just my editor on the shoulder, it's myself. So these are 3 examples about inclusive storytelling, and I'm super excited to take some questions. I know we're running a little late.
Robert, we have a question from Deborah who asks, What do you think is the biggest mistake that people make when they try to be inclusive in their writing?
I think the biggest mistake is a paint by numbers approach, where they sort of say, well, I have a Black person, I have a Latino person, I have an Asian, and they have those voices animate things that they already believe. They use those folks as tropes instead of listening for things that would be different. One of the things that I try to do is I challenge myself. If I have a theory of a story and how it's going to go, I try to work as hard to find as many people who might disagree with me. It makes the story richer. So you don't do it in a frivolous way, but you do it in an intentional, deep way that will force you to think about things you didn't before. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I have a question about something. You shared with us some text messages in which you, it gave us a little bit of a picture of how you approach people. How do you, especially on topics where people feel guarded, how do you break down some of those barriers to get people to talk about these very important issues?
Yeah, much like with the conversations with my editor, I try to strike an understanding that if we want the world to be a better place, which is what journalism wants, that it sometimes requires us to do uncomfortable things. And I ask them to join me on that journey. So it's not an aggressive ask, it's an ask in saying, listen, I know what this story is about and I know it's hard, but I do think that there's a power in telling it. And I hope they join with me on that. And another thing is, if it's a person who's not an official source, I try very hard not to do hard pressure. I don't think it's good, and I think it can be very manipulative for a person to feel like they're against the wall. I want them to join me on the purpose of the story.
Great. We have a question from Mahela who says, when you go to your sources or search for your sources, are you looking at their backgrounds? And what are you looking for when you look into their background?
Yeah, so I mean, the first the first thing I try to do is I try to make sure if there's a trail, I Google them, I look to see if there's an arrest record or something like that. But I also try to think about how they fit into the jigsaw puzzle of the journalism that I'm trying to do. So if, like I said, if they all look or sound the same, to me that doesn't feel right. That if they're all, one source could be 50 sources, that doesn't feel right either. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of create a tableau that I can choose from when I'm writing.
Excellent. One thing that, we have a number of freelancers. We also have a number of people who work in corporate communications or in newsrooms directly. And you mentioned the great relationship that you have with your editor and posing these questions and writing these mission statements for stories. What advice would you have for a writer who doesn't have a connection with their editor, or they're pitching a publication with somebody they haven't worked with before?
Yeah, I think in their background helps. It's to understand what the publication or the editor is drawn to and sort of seeing where the intersections are. And I think, even if you have your own personal mission statement about how you want to pursue this story, sometimes you need to work a little bit higher up in that ladder of abstraction. So like people don't see maybe the nitty gritty that might make them be a little bit more hesitant, but that they understand the universal themes that you're trying to evince. One thing that I think made the George Floyd episode in this country so effective is that he pleaded for his mother, and everyone knows what it's like to cry for their mom. And when we're thinking about stories or producing things that can affect people, I think that's also true, that you want to be able to hit particular points that will be able to universalize.
It's a great point about finding that universal truth. Sanjeev asks, in the specific context of the Floyd story, how do you keep a cap on your own emotion? That must be the greatest challenge. You said you look for answers that challenge your mindset, but that has to be difficult in the face of the atrocity that's central to your story.
Yeah. Uh, a lot of times I, I, I'm not a particularly angry person. I get sad or just I get sad or frustrated a lot more. But when I have an interview with a source, it's more like a running dialogue, and they know a lot about what's going on in my head. So if something's really sad, I'll say to them, "This is really sad to me. I need a breath." Sometimes I say to them, "Do you need a breath? It's a lot." And that's how we do it. And then I think when you're in the course of reporting, so much of it is trying to figure out where everything fits into the story, and you don't want your own personal emotion to overwhelm the person you're dealing with. And so I come home, I talk about it, I journal, and sometimes it hits me in very strange ways. I mean, there have been times where I've read pieces and I've found myself in wells of tears, and in ways that I don't fully expect. And that's usually an indicator that I hadn't really dealt with it.
Deborah points out, and Steve pointed out in the chat, Steve Padilla noted that in the excerpts that you shared with us of your stories, the rhythm and the musical phrasing of your writing sang through. And so Deborah asks, do you have any thoughts on how do you approach the writing? Once you've gathered the material, how do you decide how you're going to phrase, how you're going to put the pieces together, so that you find that rhythm in the writing?
Yeah, it's weird because I know Steve talks about this too, but for me, some of it is I love the structure of musicals, and I think about the way some music, when I started for like the George Floyd story, like I thought about the opening of Aladdin, where there's a man riding on a camel, and it's a little mysterious because I come from from a faraway place where the caravan camels roam. And if you look at the lead, it's sort of like almost embarrassingly follows that sort of rhythm. But the most important thing that I learned, like a lot of people talk about reading stories out loud, and it really helps. But one thing that I thought completely changed my way is I got married, and my wife wanted to know what I was working on. And I would actually read them to her before she went to bed, stories to her before she went to bed, as if I was reading a children's book, with the voices and with the actual movement of language. And to me, doing that changed the way I was writing, because even when you read it to yourself, you're still kind of like hearing your internal voice. But when you actually kind of have to perform it, you see things and you hear things that don't sound right and that you want to hear differently.
That's fantastic. It's kind of like what Steve was saying earlier about finding a writing buddy, or a reading buddy in this case, to voice it out loud. That's great. So we have another question from Mahela, who says, do you ask your mom to read your drafts for feedback, incorporating family?
My mother she doesn't have the attention span for the drafts, but I talk to her a little bit about it, and sometimes I'll say, hey, these are the two ways I'm thinking about doing a story. Which way would you want to read more of? And then I'll go from there. Yeah,
that's great. So Diane asked a question about during the interview itself, during an interview itself. When you're looking or telling somebody you're interviewing is telling you a wrenching story and they're clearly upset. Diane wants to know, is it ever okay to touch, like offer some kind of personal touch to the interviewee? You talked about, developing a relationship, but like, it's a physical line that can be crossed.
I mean, it depends. It depends on you, and it depends on the person. I mean, some folks really want to have that interpersonal connection with you. And sometimes I've noticed I've done it unintentionally, but it's like, I'm hearing someone talk and my first instinct is to sort of grab myself. And there have been times when I'm sort of like mentioning an anecdote and I've noticed I've like placed my hands on a shoulder. But that's because I'm like, I'm actually feeling like we're having an intimate conversation. But I think that that depends. It depends on you. It depends on the person.
That's great. And we have one more question. I encourage anybody who would like to ask Robert a question, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A so we can get to it. We have only a few more minutes. Deborah asks, what do you think about the overall balance in media related to reporting about diverse people?
Well, it's terrible. And I think there are a few issues. One is there aren't enough stories about people of color and people who are not cis white men that do not have to do with that person's identity. You know, like the idea that there's a very special report anytime you have a story about a person of color is something that I think is fading, but it's still very present. But the second thing has to do with the approach to stories. And that's why I thought the Pete Buttigieg story is a good example. Like we can all be in a room and hear the same thing, but how the information is processed feels different. And if you're able to tap into the empathy of people who don't look like you, I see a question about the Latin community, and yes, I have spoken with Latinos about race, even though my Spanish is incredibly poor. But if you're able to tap into that empathy, it doesn't matter what your lens is. Like you have to be able to channel the voices and the questions of other people. And that depends on the sources you have, that depends on who you talk to, that depends on who your friends are. And I think from there, you know, the ways we talk about politics or the economy, that's where some of the biggest feelings are, because they still come from the same perspective of who's on your shoulder.
That's fantastic. Well, Robert, we're so grateful that you joined us today. And this framework of thinking about the people on your shoulder and this guide to thinking about how we might approach this from, you know, the questions you ask yourself, the conversation you have with yourself, then with your editor, and then with your sources, where some people go directly to the other side of they start at the end, has been really, really helpful. It looks like May Tai has another question. This will be our last question for the afternoon for Robert. But the question is, what are your thoughts on the recent public stance many corporations have taken on issues of systemic racism? How can they balance asserting their values with staying out of the politics, which is the pushback we hear from many employees? Or should they even keep balance?
Right. So it's sad that identities become political, right? But I do think that from a media perspective, right? If our goals are to tell truths as fully as possible, you can't tell the story of this country, you can't uphold these democratic values without talking about those things. And so I think in terms of politics being Democrat or Republican, liberal leaning or not, that's not what we're talking about. Like we're talking about telling stories fully with people, with stakeholders at the center of them. And those stakeholders don't look the same, and how they operate is predicated in a lot of ways on how things that happened to people before them. And when we acknowledge that, I think we can tell fuller stories. So I don't see these things as particularly political. I do see them as really great business practices for people who want to do good, honest business.
What a great place to end this afternoon. Robert, thank you again so much for taking the time and sharing your expertise and these in-depth looks at the stories that you've done and how you have shaped them from the start with inclusivity in mind. So thank you so much. We're going to take a brief break. We'll see you back at 3 o'clock. And thank you again, Robert.